December 12, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain Island. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Matsuda stood on the observation deck of Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, squinting through his binoculars at the distant horizon, his confidence as solid as the concrete beneath his feet. The morning sun glinted off the calm waters of Simpson Harbor, where Japanese destroyers and supply ships lay at anchor, protected by the most formidable anti-aircraft network in the South Pacific. "Our air defense system is impenetrable," he assured his subordinate officers with practiced conviction. "The Americans may have superior numbers, but their tactics are predictable. They will meet the same fate as all who challenge the Emperor's will." Little did Matsuda know that within 72 hours, everything he believed about American bombing strategy would be turned upside down, quite literally. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable account of how a simple tactical reversal by American bombers not only confounded Japanese defensive strategies, but fundamentally altered the psychological warfare between two aerial powers, revealing how innovation in the skies could achieve what overwhelming force alone could not. The war in the Pacific had reached a critical juncture by late 1943. After the decisive American victory at Midway and subsequent island-hopping campaign, Allied forces were steadily pushing back the boundaries of Japan's so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Yet the Japanese defensive perimeter remained formidable. Anchored by heavily fortified island bases like Rabaul on New Britain, a natural fortress, transformed into one of Japan's most significant military installations outside the home islands. Captain Theodore "Teddy" Westfield of the United States Army Air Force's 345th Bombardment Group slouched in his chair during the pre-mission briefing on Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The 28th birthday he had celebrated the previous evening had left him with a pounding headache, though he'd never admit that to the 30 men seated around him in the sweltering tent that served as their operations center. "Gentlemen," announced Colonel Robert Maxwell, a weathered 52-year-old career officer whose leathery skin spoke of too many hours at high altitude, "intelligence reports 43 operational fighters at Rabaul, along with 72 anti-aircraft positions concentrated around Simpson Harbor and Lakunai Airfield." He tapped a wooden pointer against the large map pinned to the blackboard. "Previous bombing runs have met with unacceptable losses, 27% casualty rate on the last 3 missions. Maxwell paused, his eyes scanning the faces of young men who understood the mathematics all too well. 27% meant that more than 1 in 4 of them might not return from tomorrow's mission. The tent fell silent, except for the distant drone of generator engines and the persistent buzz of mosquitoes. "However," Maxwell continued, "Brigadier General Carmichael has authorized an experimental approach proposed by Major Raymond Simmons from Operations Research. Major, please explain your concept." Major Simmons stepped forward, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. At 36, he represented a new breed of military officer, one whose battlefield was populated by statistical models and probability matrices rather than trenches and machine gun nests. "The Japanese have become adept at predicting our bombing patterns," Simmons explained, unrolling a set of diagrams. "They've studied our approach vectors, bombing altitudes, and, most critically, our formation sequencing. Their anti-aircraft batteries are pre-sighted to our standard bomb release points, and their fighters are vectored to intercept at precisely calculated coordinates." Private First Class Daniel Rosenberg, a 20-year-old radio operator from Brooklyn, leaned toward Westfield. "He's saying they know where we'll be before we get there," he whispered. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Private," Simmons responded, having overheard the comment. "And what happens when your opponent can predict your every move?" "You lose," said Lieutenant James Harrington, a navigator whose mathematical mind had earned him the nickname Protractor. "Like in chess." "Precisely," Simmons confirmed. "So we're going to change the game. Tomorrow, gentlemen, you will be flying your bombing runs backwards." The puzzled expressions around the room prompted Simmons to elaborate. He pointed to a diagram showing the standard American bombing formation, a staggered arrangement of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses approaching their target from a consistent direction altitude, and speed. Typically, we approach from the southeast, maintain 27,000 feet, and release at this point here, he indicated on the map. The Japanese have calibrated their defenses accordingly. Their Type 98 anti-aircraft guns are zeroed to these coordinates, and their fighters climb to intercept along these vectors. Simmons flipped to a new diagram. Tomorrow you'll approach from the northwest, the opposite direction. You'll come in at 23,000 feet, 4,000 feet lower than usual. And most importantly, you'll invert the formation order. Captain Westfield straightened in his chair. You mean lead bombers become tail end and vice versa? Exactly. The entire formation sequence will be reversed. The Japanese will be expecting the lead bombers, usually the most experienced crews, to arrive first at the traditional release point. Instead, they'll encounter what would normally be the rear elements of your formation, while their fighters are still climbing to intercept a threat that isn't where it's supposed to be. Sergeant Frank Murphy, a 31-year-old gunner from Chicago with 3 years of combat experience, raised his hand. With respect, Major, isn't this just going to get us killed from a different direction? Their AA guns can still swivel, last I checked. Simmons smiled. An excellent question, Sergeant. This brings me to the second part of our strategy. Intelligence has analyzed hundreds of combat reports and determined that Japanese anti-aircraft batteries follow a predictable firing sequence based on their training protocols. They track lead aircraft first, establish range with initial salvos, then adjust fire progressively through the formation. He pointed to a series of calculations. There's a measurable lag of approximately 8 seconds between targeting adjustments. By inverting the formation, we disrupt their firing solution sequence. Their gunners will be tracking phantom trajectories based on expected formation positions that no longer exist. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Williams, commanding officer of the 345th 2nd Squadron, frowned. And their fighters. Zero pilots aren't exactly bound by fixed protocols. True, Simmons acknowledged, but they are constrained by fuel limitations and command instructions. Japanese fighter tactics against bomber formations are highly regimented. Squadron leaders target the lead bombers, while wingmen are assigned to specific positions in our formations. By the time they realize the formation is inverted, they'll have committed to attack vectors that are no longer optimal. Colonel Maxwell resumed control of the briefing. Gentlemen, I won't pretend this isn't a risk, but continuing with current tactics guarantees casualties we cannot sustain. Major Simmons's analysis suggests we could reduce losses by 60% while increasing bombing accuracy by 28%. The mission remains the same. Neutralize the anti-aircraft positions around Simpson Harbor and Lakunai Airfield to prepare for follow-up strikes against Japanese naval assets. As the briefing concluded and the airmen filed out to prepare for the following morning's mission, Captain Westfield caught up with Major Simmons. Major, permission to speak freely? Of course, Captain. This plan, reversing our approach, it seems too simple. The Japanese aren't stupid. Won't they figure it out immediately? Simmons considered the question. Human minds are remarkably resistant to evidence that contradicts established patterns, Captain. The Japanese have observed our bombing tactics for months. Their defense doctrine is built around those observations. When reality contradicts expectation, there's a cognitive delay, a period where the mind tries to reconcile what it sees with what it expects to see. That delay, Captain Westfield, might only be minutes, perhaps even seconds, but in aerial combat, seconds make the difference between life and death, Westfield finished. Exactly. We are not trying to fool them forever. We just need to create enough confusion to complete one mission successfully. After that, they'll adapt, and so will we. It's a cognitive arms race. On the other side of the conflict, Lieutenant Commander Matsuda was conducting his own briefing at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Rabaul. The room was filled with officers responsible for the air defense of this critical base, men whose education and training had instilled in them a deep respect for order, hierarchy, and established protocols. American bombing formations maintain consistent patterns, Matsuda explained, pointing to intelligence photographs captured by reconnaissance aircraft. Their Boeing B-17 bombers always approach from the southeast at approximately 27,000 feet. They maintained tight formations to maximize defensive firepower from their 50-caliber machine guns. Lieutenant Taro Yamamoto, a 29-year-old fighter controller responsible for vectoring interceptors, raised his hand. "Sir, recent intelligence from our observers in the Solomon Islands suggests the Americans have been practicing unusual formation flying. Could they be planning changes to their tactics?" Matsuda dismissed the concern with a wave. "American pilots lack the discipline and training of our imperial forces. Their reliance on mass production rather than pilot skill necessitates rigid formations and predictable tactics. They cannot deviate significantly without risking collision or friendly fire incidents. Our defenses are prepared for any minor variations they might attempt." Colonel Akira Nakamura, commander of the Raboul fighter group, nodded in agreement. "My pilots report that American formations are disciplined but inflexible. Their lead aircraft, typically flown by their most experienced crews, can be identified by subtle differences in position and maneuvering. By concentrating our initial attacks on these aircraft, we can disrupt their bombing accuracy and force early releases." What neither Matsuda nor Nakamura could know was that their confidence in predicting American tactics, a confidence built on hundreds of previous encounters, was about to become their greatest vulnerability. The psychological framework through which they interpreted aerial combat had been constructed through repetition and reinforcement. Like chess masters who recognize established opening moves, they had categorized and systematized American bombing strategies into recognizable patterns. When patterns become deeply ingrained in military thinking, they create a form of cognitive inertia, a resistance to recognizing when those patterns have changed. This phenomenon, while universal among military organizations, was particularly pronounced in the Imperial Japanese military culture of 1943, where deviation from established doctrine was often seen as a form of failure rather than adaptation. Dawn broke over Henderson Field on December 14, 1943. 21 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 345th Bombardment Group stood arrayed on the airfield, their aluminum skins reflecting the early morning light. Ground crews swarmed around the massive four-engine bombers, conducting final checks and loading the last of 8,000-pound bomb loads into each aircraft. Captain Westfield walked around his aircraft, a B-17F nicknamed Brooklyn's Revenge, after Private Rosenberg's home borough. This was his 18th combat mission, and experience had taught him to personally verify critical systems before takeoff. He ran his hand along the control surfaces, checked the bomb bay mechanisms, and inspected each of the 13 50-caliber machine guns that would protect his crew from Japanese fighters. Inside the aircraft, the 9 other members of his crew performed their pre-flight rituals. Lieutenant Harvey Cooper, the co-pilot, methodically worked through the checklist. Lieutenant Harrington, the navigator, plotted their course with mathematical precision. Private Rosenberg tested the radio equipment, while Sergeant Murphy and the other gunners inspected their weapons and ammunition. At 0700 hours, the first engines sputtered to life, sending clouds of blue-gray exhaust into the tropical morning air. One by one, the massive bombers taxied into position. Colonel Maxwell's voice crackled over the radio. "Remember the plan, gentlemen. Inverted formation, northwest approach, 23,000 feet. Good hunting and good luck." In normal operations, Captain Westfield's aircraft would have been in the 3rd position of the formation due to his experience level. Today, however, according to Major Simmons's plan, he would be in the 19th position, near the rear of the formation. The least experienced crews, who would normally bring up the rear, would lead the formation today. Lieutenant Joshua Freeman, a 22-year-old pilot with only 4 combat missions under his belt, found himself in the lead aircraft. As they began their takeoff roll, Freeman felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him even harder than the force pushing him back into his seat as his heavily laden bomber accelerated down the runway. One after another, the 21 flying fortresses lifted into the sky, forming up in their unusual inverted formation as they turned northwest toward Raboul, some 420 miles distant. The flight would take approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, giving the men plenty of time to contemplate what awaited them. In the 19th aircraft, Captain Westfield watched the unfamiliar sight of flying near the rear of the formation. "Feels strange back here," he commented to Cooper. "Like being in the cheap seats at a baseball game." "Let's hope this crazy plan works," Cooper replied, adjusting the mixture controls on the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. "Otherwise, these might be the most expensive seats in the house." As they droned northwestward, climbing steadily to their assigned altitude of 23,000 feet, Westfield's thoughts turned to the Japanese defenders waiting for them. How would they react when they realized the Americans had changed the rules of the game? Would they adapt quickly, or would the cognitive dissonance create the critical opening Major Simmons had predicted? At Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Rabaul, the first warning came at 9:21 in the morning. Radar operators detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the northwest, approximately 120 miles out. Lieutenant Akira Tanaka, the radar officer on duty, immediately reported the contact to Lieutenant Commander Matsuda. "Sir, large formation detected bearing 310, range 120 miles, altitude approximately 23,000 feet. Matsuda frowned. "That bearing would put them approaching from the northwest. Recheck your readings." "Confirmed, sir. Bearing 310, definitely approaching from the northwest." Matsuda considered this information. American bombers had always approached from the southeast, using the rising sun to complicate Japanese visual tracking. A northwestern approach made little tactical sense, unless it was a diversion. Maintain tracking on this formation, but scan the southeastern quadrant as well. This could be a feint to draw our attention before the main force approaches from the usual direction. Tanaka complied, directing half of the radar operators to continue scanning the southeastern approaches, while the others tracked the incoming formation. 15 minutes passed, and still no additional contacts appeared. Colonel Nakamura, alerted to the approaching bombers, prepared to scramble his fighters. "What is the composition of the enemy formation?" he asked. "Approximately 20 aircraft, heavy bombers, most likely B-17, replied the intelligence officer. "Only 20. Their usual raids include at least 30 to 40 aircraft." Nakamura's suspicion reinforced Matsuda's theory that this might be a diversion. "I will deploy only half of our fighters to intercept this formation. Keep the remainder on standby for the main force." This decision, born of absolute confidence in their understanding of American tactics, immediately reduced the defensive response by half. 18. Mitsubishi. As 6 M0 fighters roared down the runway at Lakunai Airfield, climbing rapidly to intercept the incoming bombers. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Yamamoto, the fighter controller, began calculating intercept vectors based on the standard American formation layout. "Vector 0 Squadron to approach from ahead and above the enemy formation," he instructed. "Target the lead aircraft first, then work backward through the formation according to protocol." What none of the Japanese defenders yet realized was that the lead aircraft they would target first was actually flown by one of the least experienced American crews, while the more combat-hardened crews they would normally prioritize were now positioned at the rear of the formation. Aboard the lead B-17, Lieutenant Freeman saw the first puffs of anti-aircraft fire erupting ahead of his aircraft, black clouds that bloomed suddenly in the clear blue sky. "Flak at 12 o'clock, he reported tensely. "They've started early." His bombardier, Second Lieutenant Michael O'Malley, peered through his Norden bomb sight. "They're ranging on us, but their timing is off. The bursts are exploding about 10 seconds too early." This discrepancy, a mere 10 seconds, was the first indication that Major Simmons's theory was correct. The Japanese anti-aircraft batteries had programmed their fuses based on the expected approach speed and altitude of standard American formations. The slight differences in approach vector and altitude had thrown off their initial calculations. As the formation continued toward the target, the flak began to intensify, but its accuracy remained compromised. The Japanese gunners, trained to track formations from front to back, found themselves continuously chasing the formation rather than leading it properly. Then came the fighters. 18 Zeros climbed toward the bomber formation, their pilots following standard interception doctrine. The lead Zero pilots focused on what they believed to be the command aircraft at the front of the formation, Lieutenant Freeman's B-17. In the 19th bomber, Captain Westfield watched as the Japanese fighters concentrated their initial attacks on the forward elements of the formation. "They're following the playbook," he commented to Cooper, "just like Simmons predicted." Sergeant Murphy, manning the top turret, swung his twin .50 caliber machine guns toward an approaching Zero. They're in for a surprise when they realize the rookies are up front and the veterans are back here. The first wave of Zero attacks focused primarily on the front third of the American formation, precisely where the least experienced American crews were now flying. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a devastating tactic, targeting the leadership element of the bomber stream. Today, however, it meant the Japanese were expending their initial energy and ammunition on the least critical elements of the formation. Lieutenant Yamamoto, tracking the aerial battle from his fighter control center, was the first Japanese officer to notice something unusual. "The Americans are not responding according to standard patterns," he reported to Matsuda. "Their defensive fire is more coordinated from the rear aircraft than the lead elements." Matsuda studied the plotting board, where markers representing both American bombers and Japanese fighters moved across a gridded representation of the airspace over Rabaul. "Perhaps they've placed their more experienced gunners in the rear elements to protect against attacks from behind." "Sir," Yamamoto persisted, "I believe there may be more to it. The formation sequence appears to be inverted from their usual arrangement." Matsuda dismissed this observation. "Impossible. That would require a complete reorganization of their command structure and bombing protocols. American forces lack the tactical flexibility for such adjustments." This dismissal, rooted in a combination of cultural bias and tactical dogma, cost the Japanese defenders precious minutes of adaptation time. By the time Colonel Nakamura began to suspect that something was indeed unusual about this American formation, the bombers had closed to within 5 minutes of their target release point. In the lead B-17, Lieutenant Freeman fought to maintain his position as his aircraft shuddered under the impact of machine gun fire from a Zero that had made a frontal attack. His inexperience showed as he overcorrected, momentarily drifting out of formation before steadying the massive bomber. "5 minutes to target," called out his navigator. Freeman keyed his microphone. "All aircraft, maintain formation integrity. 5 minutes to target." In the 19th position, Captain Westfield watched as the formation ahead of him absorbed the brunt of the Japanese fighter attacks. Despite their inexperience, the forward crews were holding together remarkably well. The inverted formation strategy was working exactly as Simmons had predicted. The Japanese defenders were still following their standard attack protocols, despite growing evidence that something was different about this American formation. At Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, the realization finally dawned on Lieutenant Commander Matsuda as he observed the bombing formation's approach vector and the distribution of defensive fire. "They've inverted their entire formation," he exclaimed. "The lead aircraft are actually their least experienced crews, and their veterans are in the rear positions." Colonel Nakamura, hearing this assessment via radio, immediately attempted to redirect his fighters. "All units change attack priority. Target the rear elements of the enemy formation. I repeat, concentrate on the rear aircraft." But the order came too late. The Zeros, having already committed to their initial attack patterns, had expended significant fuel and ammunition on the forward elements of the American formation. Many were now forced to break off to rearm and refuel, while others found themselves out of position to effectively engage the rear bombers. Lieutenant Yamamoto tried to vector the remaining fighters toward the rear of the American formation, but the confusion created by this tactical reversal had disrupted the carefully choreographed Japanese defense. Fighter pilots, trained to follow specific interception protocols, now received contradictory instructions as their commanders attempted to adapt to the unexpected situation. In the lead B-17, Lieutenant Freeman's bombardier called out, "Approaching release point. Bombs away in 30 seconds." The next 3 minutes would demonstrate the full impact of Major Simmons's strategy. As the American bombers began their bomb runs, the Japanese anti-aircraft batteries continued to struggle with targeting solutions. Their fire control systems, calibrated for approaches from the southeast at 27,000 feet, required significant manual adjustments to track the northwestern approach at 23,000 feet. "Bombs away," called Lieutenant O'Malley as the first bombs fell from Freeman's aircraft. One by one, the B-17s released their deadly payloads, the bombs falling in a cascading pattern toward the Japanese installations below. Captain Westfield, near the rear of the formation, had a perfect view of the unfolding bombardment. The anti-aircraft fire, while intense, was noticeably less accurate than on previous missions. The Japanese fighters, having concentrated on the forward elements of the formation, were now scrambling to engage the rear aircraft, but finding themselves at disadvantageous attack angles. "Bombs away," reported Westfield's bombardier, Lieutenant David Shapiro, as 8,000 pounds of high explosives fell from Brooklyn's Revenge toward the anti-aircraft emplacements below. On the ground, Lieutenant Commander Matsuda watched in dismay as the American bombs fell with devastating accuracy. The confusion created by their reversed approach had disrupted the coordinated fire from the anti-aircraft batteries, allowing the bombers to complete their runs with significantly less opposition than usual. The psychological impact of this tactical innovation extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Japanese commanders had built their defensive strategies around a fundamental assumption that American tactics were predictable, inflexible, and bound by standard operating procedures. The simple act of reversing the formation had not merely bypassed their physical defenses, it had penetrated their cognitive defenses as well. As the last bombs fell and the B-17 formation turned southward to return to Henderson Field, Captain Westfield conducted a quick assessment of their losses. 3 bombers had been shot down, a casualty rate of 14% compared to the 27% they had been suffering on recent missions. Major Simmons's strategy had indeed cut their losses by nearly half. More importantly, reconnaissance photographs taken during the mission would later show that they had destroyed 32 of the 72 anti-aircraft positions around Simpson Harbor and Lakunai Airfield, a success rate nearly double that of previous raids. Lieutenant Freeman's aircraft, despite having absorbed significant damage as the formation leader, managed to return safely to Henderson Field. As the crews gathered for debriefing, Colonel Maxwell announced the preliminary results. "Gentlemen, today's mission was an unqualified success. Not only did we reduce our losses significantly, but bomb damage assessment indicates we achieved nearly twice the target destruction of previous raids." Major Simmons, reviewing the mission reports, appeared satisfied but not surprised. "The Japanese defenders were victims of their own rigid thinking," he explained to Colonel Maxwell. "By the time they realized what was happening, the psychological damage was done. Their commanders couldn't believe we would do something so illogical as flying our formation backwards, so they wasted precious minutes trying to reconcile their observations with their expectations." "How long will this advantage last?" Maxwell asked. "Not long," Simmons admitted. "They'll adapt quickly now that they've seen it. But that's the nature of tactical innovation. It creates temporary windows of opportunity. Our job is to recognize when those windows are closing and open new ones." Indeed, in Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Matsuda was already conducting a thorough analysis of what had gone wrong. "The Americans have demonstrated a tactical flexibility we did not anticipate," he acknowledged to his staff. "We must prepare for further variations in their approach vectors, altitudes, and formation structures." Colonel Nakamura nodded grimly. "My pilots report that the Americans had placed their most experienced crews in the rear of the formation, completely inverting their normal configuration. We targeted what we believed were their command aircraft, only to discover we were attacking their least essential elements." This realization, that American forces were capable of rapid tactical innovation, rippled through the Japanese command structure. Reports were dispatched to headquarters in Truk and ultimately to Tokyo, warning other defensive installations to prepare for similar American tactics. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. The implicit assumption of American predictability, rooted partly in racist beliefs about Western inflexibility and partly in the Japanese military's own doctrinal rigidity, had been shattered. If Americans could reverse their formations, what other established truths about their tactics might prove false? Captain Westfield, unaware of the psychological crisis he had helped create among the Japanese command, focused on the immediate practical outcomes. "So we surprised them once," he commented to Major Simmons during the post-mission analysis. "What's our next move? They'll be expecting reversed formations now." Simmons smiled. "Exactly right, Captain. Our next raid will use standard formation order, but vary the approach vector and altitude again, then perhaps a mixed formation after that, with experienced crews distributed throughout. The goal isn't to find one perfect formation, but to create persistent uncertainty." "Psychological warfare through formation flying," Westfield mused. "Precisely. In aerial combat, as in chess, forcing your opponent to question their basic assumptions creates opportunities that superior firepower alone cannot achieve." The mission against Rabaul on December 14, 1943, would later be studied at both American and Japanese war colleges as an example of how simple tactical innovations could have disproportionate effects by exploiting psychological biases in enemy defense doctrines. For the remainder of the Pacific campaign, Japanese air defense commanders would approach every American bombing formation with a degree of uncertainty that had not existed before. The cognitive confidence that had allowed them to predict American movements with near certainty had been replaced by a nagging doubt, a voice in the back of their minds asking, "What if they're doing something unexpected again?" This doubt, though impossible to quantify in terms of bombs dropped or aircraft lost, represented a significant strategic advantage for Allied forces. By demonstrating tactical unpredictability, the Americans had imposed a mental tax on Japanese defenders, forcing them to consider and prepare for multiple possible variations rather than confidently committing to a single expected pattern. Lieutenant Commander Matsuda would later write in his personal journal, "The Americans have revealed themselves to be more adaptable than our doctrine anticipated. Their willingness to abandon established procedures for temporary advantage suggests a pragmatism we had not observed in previous engagements. This flexibility, more than their industrial capacity or numerical superiority, presents the greatest challenge to our defensive strategies." This observation, that adaptability might be America's most dangerous weapon, would prove prophetic as the war in the Pacific continued. The American military's willingness to experiment with tactics, to question established doctrines, and to learn from both successes and failures would accelerate as the war progressed. 6 months later, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation would be decimated in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided aerial battle that demonstrated the cumulative effects of American tactical evolution and Japanese doctrinal stagnation. Captain Westfield would fly 15 more missions before completing his tour of duty. On his final flight, he would lead a formation that approached from the northeast at an altitude of 25,000 feet, with experienced and inexperienced crews deliberately intermixed throughout the formation, a far cry from the rigidly structured formations that had characterized early American bombing doctrine. As for Major Simmons, his success with the backwards bombing strategy would earn him a promotion and a transfer to the Pentagon, where he would continue developing innovative tactical approaches based on psychological principles. His work would influence not only the remaining Pacific campaign, but also bombing doctrine in the European theater. The legacy of that December mission over Rabaul, the day Japanese commanders couldn't believe American bombers were flying backwards, would live on in military tactical education for decades. It served as a powerful reminder that warfare exists not merely in the physical domain of weapons and formations, but in the cognitive domain of expectations and assumptions. In the debriefing room at Henderson Field, as the aircrews dispersed to write letters home or seek what little comfort could be found in their Spartan accommodations, Colonel Maxwell approached Captain Westfield. "Impressive work today, Teddy. The kind of mission that might just shorten this war a bit." Westfield nodded thoughtfully. "It wasn't about flying backwards, was it? It was about making them doubt what they thought they knew." "That's the real victory," Maxwell agreed. "Not the anti-aircraft guns we destroyed, but the certainty we demolished. And that demolition of certainty, achieved not through overwhelming force, but through simple tactical innovation, would prove to be one of the most cost-effective weapons in the American arsenal." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.